Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Sarah, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here in McFarland. We are very honored to have Chad Lewis with us tonight. He is a researcher, author, lecturer, and I've heard amazing things about what he talks about and his book. So, Chad, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the staff for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Wisconsin's gangster history here in the comfort of the public library or wherever you're watching this from on the live stream. As you heard, my name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, I've spent the last 30 years traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from weird roadside attractions to odd places, some unique people, strange folklore, histories, anomaly, you name it. If it's just a little offbeat and odd, I've traveled the world in search of it. They also have a Paradise, Michigan. You can pick which one you want to go to. But it wasn't until the early 2000s when I was up in the Northwoods of the state working on a book about Wisconsin ghosts. My car got a flat tire, so I got out and repaired the tire, worked up a nice little thirst. I looked over and there was a lodge right in front of me. So I thought I'd drop in and grab a can of pop. Well, lo and behold, that place was called Little Bohemia. I didn't know it at the time, but it seemed as though fate had stepped in and provided me a little detour from things that go bump in the night to things that will bump you off. And that eventually became the book and the program you're going to see this evening. And I really want this program to be a time portal back to the days when the gangsters robbed our banks, kidnapped our citizens, and mowed down anybody who got in their way. So for the next 45 minutes or so, you can sit back and relax as we explore the gangster history of Wisconsin. Now, of course, the gangsters themselves, they're no longer at these places. But the places themselves, they're still there. But for how much longer, I don't know. I always encourage people to get to these places while you still can, because every year we're losing more and more of these historic treasures. So with that, throw on your zoot suit or your flapper dress as we explore the gangster history of our state. And the first question we have to ask, what was it about Wisconsin that the gangsters loved? Why did they all want to be here? Well, there are numerous reasons. The first, obviously, was our close proximity to Chicago, which during Prohibition was the bootlegging capital of the world. Operated by Al Capone on your left and his arch nemesis George Bugs Moran on your right. Now, a lot of people remember Al in part thanks to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 when Al had many of Bugs Moran's men gunned down in Chicago while Al was on vacation in Florida with an alibi. So they were out of Chicago, but the second reason they loved Wisconsin is they loved St. Paul, Minnesota. And the best way to get from Chicago to St. Paul was right through our state. The reason they loved St. Paul? This guy, Police Chief John O'Connor. See, in the early 1900s, when every other community was trying to keep criminals out, O'Connor took a different approach. He invited criminals to St. Paul. If you were a criminal from anywhere in the world, you could go to St. Paul, register with the police, and do whatever the heck you wanted. Prostitution? No problem. Gambling? Be our guest. But there was one catch to this agreement. You couldn't do it in the city of St. Paul. If you wanted to head to, Wilmer, Minnesota, and rob their banks, which you can see they did, you were free to do so, but there'd be no crime inside the city of St. Paul. Therefore, in the 20s and 30s, there were more crooks in the saintly city than nearly anywhere else in the world. Yet it was safer for you to be there than nearly anywhere else as well. In fact, so many criminals were lurking there that noted bank robber Alvin Creepy Carpus, I know, great nickname, once said that if he was thinking of a buddy he hadn't seen in a while, he immediately thought of two places, prison or St. Paul, because if his buddy wasn't in one, they were hanging out in the other one. But the third reason they loved Wisconsin, the same reason we love Wisconsin, the beautiful Northwoods. When the heat was too much literally down in Chicago, they would go up to the seclusion of the Northwoods and relax in the comfort and safety of our great Northwoods. Now today you can't throw a rock in Wisconsin without hitting a place that is thought to be tied to Al Capone, including the old Maribel Caves Hotel in Maribel, the Shipwreck Brew Pub in Door County, the old Baraboo Inn in Baraboo, Pipes, Capone and Pipes, and Manitowoc Capone. Even in Brookfield, they claim that Al used to live in this house right in town. And if you're looking for it, it's easy to find. Just look for Capone Court and you'll see it right away. But one place we do know that Al actually was at was the aptly named hideout near Couturier, not far from Hayward. This is where Al had a nice resort constructed for him to come up and spend his weekends in luxury with all of his colleagues. They would go out hunting and fishing. A lot of people didn't realize that Al and his brother Ralph Bottles Capone, they were avid outdoorsmen, as most men of that era were. So they'd like to come up and relax in the comfort of the Northwoods. But for Al, security was his number one concern, which is why he had towers on the property. 24 hours a day, he'd have his men up in the towers with their Tommy guns, watching the entrances and exits, meaning that if you tried showing up to Al's unannounced or uninvited, you'd probably get a very unwelcome response while going there. Some of you might remember touring this place. For years, it operated as a roadside attraction that you could pay to tour. Those who did were often at first confused by what this building was used for. But when they got closer, they realized this is where Al did a lot of his negotiating with his competitors. He would bring them up north, throw them in jail. If they did not see his way of doing business, they often ended up at the bottom of the lake out back, where he had spirits flown in from Canada. Unfortunately, the place went bankrupt. It was put on the auction block. The Le Couturier tribe bought it, which is fitting since Al bought it from the Le Couturier tribe back in the 20s as well. Without a doubt, the deadliest gangsters ever to set foot in Wisconsin was this gang, the Barker Carpus gang, made up of Alvin Creepy Carpus, remember prisoner St. Paul, and whatever Barker boys happened to be out of prison at the time. What Carpus was doing with the Barkers, I have no idea. He was thought to be one of the most intelligent gangsters of all time. So why he was chumming with the Barkers, who let's just say were not the most intelligent, I don't know, maybe that's why they loved one another. But before we talk about the gang, we have to address the legend of their mother, Ma Barker. A lot of you are probably familiar with the legend of Ma, and it goes something like this. Ma was a mastermind, gun-toting criminal who took her young, innocent boys off on a life of crime, turning them into killers and bank robbers. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or planning of any of the crimes. We're going to catch up with Ma a little bit later in the program down in Florida, and you'll see how the legend of Ma began. But where she lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. Now you might remember this was the gang that kidnapped William Hamm in 1933. He was the heir to the Hamm's brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom. Quite a sum of money back then. They treated him pretty well. They fed him. They even brought him beer. It wasn't hams. They didn't want to torture the poor guy. He said he couldn't tell the difference anyway. 6 months later, they took Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune. They got a $200,000 ransom out of him. This allowed them to have safe houses, welcome, all over the Midwest, like the one on South Robert Street in St. Paul that is still there to this day. They were renting this out from the landlady next door. They were renting it out under the guise of being musicians traveling with their senior mother. But the landlady, she had a son who worked at a speakeasy. And one night it was pretty slow. He happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when all of a sudden he came across a wanted poster for those musicians living next to his mother. He immediately went down to the police, said the Barker Carpus gang's living next to my mother. They put him in a back room and said, "You're going to be a hero. We'll take care of this with one phone call." Unfortunately, he ran into Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Midwest history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of it with one phone call, and he did. Anyone want to guess who he called? The Barker Carpus gang. He said, "The feds are going to raid your place. Get the heck out of there." Now, they had no idea it was this wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Mr. Dunlop. He was an alcoholic, and when he became intoxicated, he would brag about the exploits of the gang. So they thought he was too hot even for St. Paul. They had to get him out of there. Why not take him on a nice little vacation to Wisconsin? Well, this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of the vacations that you didn't come back from. They brought him up near Siren in the Webster area of Wisconsin to a place called Fremstead Lake here. They shot him several times, dumped his naked body on the side of the lake, and threw money on it to make it look like a mob hit. In fact, years later, after retiring, the local sheriff used to go around jokingly claiming that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care. It was just another dead gangster. In fact, when I dug up Dunlop's death certificate, they had no idea who he was. When they had to list his occupation, they put unknown, suspected underworld character. The laser doesn't show up on the screen, but right there on your left in the middle. Kind of a cool title to have back then, although usually meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. But when the gangsters weren't robbing our banks or kidnapping us, they liked to relax at all the speakeasies throughout Wisconsin. If you forgot, speakeasies during Prohibition were places where you could go and illegally dance, drink, gamble. They had ladies of the night working at these places, and we had them all over Wisconsin. In fact, we had so many that I think here in Wisconsin, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law, because they were littering out throughout the whole state. And one of their favorite places was up near Minocqua in Woodruff, a place called Ma Bailey's House of Ill Repute. Actually, they just called it Ma's back then. What would happen is the gangsters would make their way into Minocqua, spend their night gambling and eating at places like the Belle Isle. Then they might get a little nightcap at the Norwood Pines Supper Club, which is still there, a classic Wisconsin supper club. And then when they were finished, they'd go out to Ma's sprawling estate. In the 1920s, this was a risque place. Outside of being a brothel, it had nude murals on the walls, a place you wouldn't want to be caught at, which is exactly our next story, because Ma's did not shut down until almost 1950. You might be saying to yourself, how in the heck could a brothel in Wisconsin operate until 1950? Well, this next story may illustrate that. Two young men were coming home from a Rhinelander road trip. They decided to stop into Ma's to see what all the fuss was about. But when they got in, they said, "We better get out of here. If we get caught out here, we're going to be in trouble." because when they walked in, there was an X-rated movie being shown in the establishment. But then the lights came on, they relaxed, had a couple beers. The reason they relaxed is when the lights came on, they realized that the man running the projector was the town judge. Therefore, they never closed down Ma's because everyone who could close it down was out at Ma's. They finally got Ma the same way they got Al Capone, tax evasion. They didn't care she was running a bordello in the Northwoods. They were upset they weren't getting a cut of that bordello. Over the years, they tried to make it a real business. It was a bar and a grill, a restaurant, and eventually it fell into private hands where it is today. But I do keep an eye on this property because every once in a while it does hit the market for sale. If you're looking to own a piece of Wisconsin's unique history, or maybe you're looking to start your own brothel, you might want to keep an eye on Ma Bailey's House of Ill Repute. Now, if you think today the media focuses a lot on crime, and they do, start digging through the old newspaper archives during Prohibition. You'd be amazed to see all the crime on every front page newspaper. Most of the criminals were terrible at it. They got caught right away. They had no business being in that line of work. But others seem to be born to be criminals, like our next gentleman, none other than John Dillinger, public enemy number one, perhaps the most infamous bank robber in America's history. Now, if you forgot Dillinger's story, he was a bank robber from 1933 until 1934. Most people, when they used to show these wanted posters in front of movies like trailers are shown today, people would stand up and start cheering for him like he was some sort of folk hero. They'd say, who cares if he's robbing the banks? The banks are stealing from me. They foreclosed on Grandma and Grandpa's farm. They took it away. So, believe it or not, a lot of people were cheering for people like Dillinger. But regardless of what you make of him, when he came to Wisconsin, trouble seemed to follow him. First stop, Racine, November of 1933. Dillinger and his gang wanted to make a withdrawal from the American Bank and Trust. In fact, they wanted to take every penny the bank had. So on the day of the robbery, they pulled around back, which it looks like this today, and their game plan was to leave the car running with their getaway driver, Russell Clark, in the back of the building. But this meant that they'd have to rob the bank, run all the way around the block to get to their escape vehicle. There was a small back door, but whether they didn't know this or they didn't care, maybe they were bored with their lives even though they were bank robbers, they went through with their first plan. So Russell Clark stays with the car. Meanwhile, Dillinger and his gang, which at the time was made up of Harry Pierpont, Three-Finger Jack John Red Hamilton, and Charles Makeley. Makeley, a dangerous man, was the first one in. He went right up to the teller, who was busy counting out change, and he said, "This is a stick-up, give us your money." The teller thought he was joking. He didn't even look up. He said, "Next window, please." Makeley shot him in the shoulder. That got his attention, but it also triggered the alarms, and the police raced to the building. Well, not exactly. Back then, false alarms were so common at banks that the police took their time getting there. When they got there, they were taken hostage as well. They took the security guard and a bank employee. Normally, they liked taking young female tellers with them as shields, and they did. They took one as well. They would make them ride on the running board so the police wouldn't shoot them on their way out. So they gathered up the hostages, and Makeley said, "Let's show these Wisconsin people how we do things," because a crowd was kind of gathering outside the bank to see what the fuss was about. So he blasted out the front windows of the bank, dispersing the crowd. Then they got in their car and they sped off to Milwaukee. But they had a very high-tech way of eluding the police. What they would do is in their back seat, they would keep a big bucket of roofing tacks and nails. Back then, police had no two-way radios. All they could do was chase you. So the gangsters would rob a bank, throw these nails on the road as they left, and the police would follow, pop their tires, and the chase would be over. That's exactly what they did. Today, unfortunately, the bank is no longer a bank. It is now the Racine Art Museum, or the RAM. But after the robbery, they collected all the artifacts, some of the weaponry, the bullet casings. They even collected the newspaper accounts and made a nice little display for it. But what I love is where they put this display. Because where else would you want a display for the most famous gangster of all time? Well, there's only one place to put that display, and that's right in the front lobby of your local police department, which is exactly where it is today. But fair warning, for those of you who are currently on the lam from the law, this is a working police station. You may want to avoid this spot and move on to our next category. Oh, I don't know how Billy Frechette made it in here. Sometimes she's in programs, other times she's not. She was one of Dillinger's main squeezes. After she spent time in prison, she was released and spent the rest of her life on the Menominee Reservation by Green Bay, where her family was from. But good to see her in here. Babyface Nelson, out of all the gangsters I researched, I had the most fun and the most trouble with this young man. Lester Gillis, but better known as George Babyface Nelson. I had the most trouble with him because you never knew what side of Babyface was going to show up. On the one hand, those who knew him said he was a polite, well-mannered, jovial young man. He was also perhaps the best connected gangster of all time. If you needed a weapon, a safe house, or an introduction to a fellow crook, he could do it all. And at a time when all these gangsters had numerous mistresses, the Malls as they were called, Babyface was said to be very devoted to his wife Helen and their 2 young children. But before you start thinking of Babyface as some type of angel, remember I said there was a flip side to him. And that flip side was his own temper. Many of his colleagues did not like working with him. When they would divvy up the loot, they'd form a circle and let him hand out the money. He thought it was because he was in charge. But in actuality, people formed a circle because no one wanted their back to him, thinking he might just shoot you and take your portion of the bank robbery. But when Babyface came to Wisconsin, we got to see both sides of his personality. First stop, Babyface is driving with his wife Helen. They're heading up north. They make it just north of here to a place called North Leeds near Arlington, Wisconsin. That's when Babyface got in an accident on this crossroads with a canning truck employee. Now Tommy Carroll, Babyface's good buddy, and his girlfriend were driving behind them. He pulled over about 100 yards back thinking Babyface is just going to shoot this guy and we'll go about our business. Instead, Babyface got out, went into the North Leeds grocery store here and made a phone call. And then when he came back out, he said, let's go get our cars fixed to the trucking employee. A few years later, this eventually turned into Thirsty's Bar and Grill. And remember, I told you to get to these places while you still can, because just a couple years back, Thirsty's burned to the ground. There's nothing left where Babyface made that phone call. So together, Babyface and the pedestrian guy made their way into Arlington to a place called the Bell Ford dealership. It's still owned by the same family, but they've moved to a bigger building now. The building's still there. Babyface went in. Nobody knew who he was, but he had his back to the wall the entire time. Reason being is when your back's to the wall, no one can sneak up behind you to shoot you or arrest you. While he was in there paying to get their cars fixed, Tommy Carroll left his car running right outside of the Arlington Inn Bar and Grill. He went in, I presume he was drinking like a fish, waiting for Babyface to shoot up the town. But instead, Babyface held it together and the foursome drove off in their 2 cars. Babyface and Helen made their way up north. They made it just until they hit Portage, Wisconsin. and their newly repaired car broke down right out in front of A.R. Slinger's garage. Ironically, it is now a liquor store. But the footprint's still the same. Instead of having spirits there, they would have cars inside on display. Babyface left his car to get fixed and said, "I'll be back to get it." He never would. The FBI would pick it up. Instead, he just hopped in with his buddy, and the two couples drove up north to Manitoush Waters, Wisconsin, Little Bohemia, where my car popped that tire. Now, it was April of 1934, which meant it was completely empty up there, dead. It wasn't filled with Chicago tourists like it is today. So the owners were very excited when a group of men pulled in, wanting to rent the place for the entire weekend. Money was no object. In fact, the owners said the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. That should have been their first clue, but again, they needed the business. But that excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the front door. Because in 1934, these were the last men in the world you'd want at your place. Top left, Dillinger. Top right, Babyface Nelson. On the bottom, Tommy Carroll. Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton in the middle. And Homer Van Meter on your bottom left. Deadly, deadly men. If the FBI could capture these men, they could throw away the most wanted list. Of course, they had their softer side with them, the malls as well. And in the beginning, the owners were excited. The men were buying all the rounds. They were tipping really well. They were telling amazing stories. The only thing that bothered the owners is all of the men seemed to have a large lump on the side of their jackets. But don't worry, they would find out what those lumps were. They made the mistake over the weekend of sending out information on a matchbox that Dillinger was in the Northwoods. They finally got word down to Melvin Purvis, who was running the Chicago division of the FBI. He flew into Rhinelander and waited for people to come from St. Paul. They were parked out at Voss's Birchwood Lodge, which is just south of Little Bohemia. Their game plan was to wait for Dillinger, but the problem was they got word that instead of leaving the next morning as planned, Dillinger was about to leave at any moment at Little Bohemia. He had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So they showed up and they were hoping just to shoot Dillinger. But when they got there a little after 9 p.m., 3 local men working for the CCC were going out to their car to go back after drinking and eating all night there. The feds panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. They opened fire on that car of CCC workers, killing one of them, injuring the other 2. Well, now all hell broke loose at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who had been staying at the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main building, could have easily snuck into the woods undetected. But instead, he came out guns blazing, shooting at them, and then he ran into the woods. We'll catch up with him in a moment. Because by Babyface shooting back, it allowed Dillinger and his men inside the main lodge to avoid all of the bullets that were being shot into the building, the front of the building. It also allowed them to escape. Their elaborate escape plan was this. They simply crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, simply had no idea there was a ravine down by the lake where the gangsters could run without being detected. They thought that everyone was trapped inside the building. Tommy Carroll just hitchhiked his way right back to St. Paul. He was at a speakeasy that very night telling stories of his escape. Dillinger took off running with Three-Finger Jack and Homer Van Meter. At gunpoint, they were able to borrow a car from a gentleman. They wanted to make their way back to St. Paul as well. But because every radio station in America was broadcasting stories about Babyface shooting up the Northwoods, they knew it was too hot to go through the north of Wisconsin. So they went through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota. And when they crossed over the old spiral bridge there, police noticed that their plates were stolen. But again, all they could do was follow them. So that's what they did. For over 20 miles, they had a gun battle with the Dillinger gang. Finally, Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road and got away. Later, they found the abandoned vehicle from the gangsters. Now, judging by the amount of blood you see photographed here, they believed that whoever was sitting in the front passenger seat would probably die from the gunfight. And they were right. Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, did die. But they didn't know that. It took them a year to find his body. They thought he was still alive the entire time. Back at Little Bohemia, Babyface should have had the easiest way out. But he had the hardest escape. He stole a car, and then he drove it and it broke down. So he saw a bunch of men sitting outside at a resort, and he pulls up to them, and he wants to buy a car or steal one from them. But as he's there, another vehicle pulls up with a couple FBI agents and some local police officers. Now, they have no idea in the darkness who's local, who's not. They're trying to recruit men to go back and fight at Little Bohemia. That's where Babyface walked up to them. According to folklore, he said, "I know you're wearing vests, so I'm going to give it to you both high and low." In actuality, he probably just started shooting them without warning. When he realized they were in no condition to fire back, he kicked them out of the car and drove off in their vehicle. Unfortunately, later, a few hours later, one of the FBI agents in that vehicle would lose his life in the gunfight. The local sheriff's deputy spent several months in the local hospital, but he did survive. Babyface drove the car for a bit, and it broke down again. So then he thought, forget it. He started walking 20 miles in the pitch black darkness through the forest until he came to a little peninsula near Lac de Flambeau. That's when he encountered Ollie Catfish and his family. He stayed with them for several nights, basically holding them hostage, and then drove to Marshfield, Wisconsin, got a car, and drove to Chicago. Sometime in the 1940s or late 30s, they don't know exactly when, Dillman's Lodge, which is a resort that sits right across the lake from Lac de Flambeau, they purchased that cabin Babyface spent the night in. They hauled it over on horse and sleigh on the ice, and it now sits at the resort as cabin number 5 that you can rent out for the evening. The back room remains kind of the same as when Babyface stayed there, but they've upgraded the rest of it. It's a gorgeous place. You'll love staying there. You'll feel like you're in the 1930s, but you won't have to worry about any gangsters shooting at you. Back at Little Bohemia, the feds were happier than could be. They thought everyone was captured. So they waited several hours before shooting tear gas into the building. You can imagine their surprise when the only people coming out were the workers and the malls. Everyone else was gone, long gone for hours. Much to the credit of Little Bohemia, they kept all the personal artifacts, the weapons, the clothing, all of it's on display. They even kept the original bullet holes in their windows from the gunfight that you can go see. They bragged that their food is so good, Dillinger only left because he had to. And he did leave. Now, the women were brought to the one place in Wisconsin that was thought to be safe enough to keep them. And that was the Dane County Jail. And they had armed guards 24 hours a day around the building because they were afraid Dillinger and his gang were going to come and break them out. They never would because they were too busy trying to stay alive themselves. And death caught them, and it caught them very quickly. 1934, imagine you're down in Chicago at the Biograph Theater. You're looking around to see if you recognize any friends or family there, when all of a sudden the guy sitting next to you looks a heck of a lot like John Dillinger. And it was Dillinger. He was being set up by a friend of his named Anna Sage. She was Romanian and ran some brothels in Chicago, so she was being threatened with deportation. So she thought if she could turn in the most wanted man in America, Not only would she get the reward, they'd have to let her stay in America. So that's what she did. She ratted out Dillinger. And for her reward, the government shipped her back to Romania. Now here's where things get weird. The FBI version of events is that Dillinger came out of the theater, saw that they were waiting for him. They yelled for him to stop, but he ran into this alleyway and tried to shoot them, but they were too quick. They shot him and he bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Witnesses that night tell a different version of events, of a well-dressed man coming out of the movie theater and being shot basically without warning in the alleyway, where he died bleeding to death waiting for help to arrive. Regardless of whether either of those versions are true, they got Dillinger. People started gathering under the biograph, hundreds of them, saying, they got Johnny, they got Dillinger, can you believe it? But they didn't stop there. Now, in the last few moments of our program, you're going to see maybe 2 or 3 or more of these caution signs. What these tell you is that the next slide or two might be a bit gory, graphic, and gruesome. So fair warning, close your eyes if you don't want to see it. I would hate for you to come up to me after the program saying, Chad, you should have warned me about those photographs. Here's your warning, because I'm going to show you what they did, because these people didn't wait under the biograph. They went into the alleyway, and here's what they did. Final warning, close your eyes. They went in and dipped their handkerchief and newspaper into the blood of Dillinger like some grisly souvenir. When they were finished there, they brought him to the morgue where they took more blood. Women cut locks of his hair. His nearly naked body was photographed. Okay, photo's gone. The next to go was Babyface. He needed a vacation and he thought, why not go to Lake Geneva? He had stayed there many times before. He knew the place well because it was operated by a fellow gangster. But as soon as he pulled into the driveway, the FBI was on the porch waiting for him. But amazingly, they didn't recognize him. So he turned his car around and drove through downtown Lake Geneva. There he saw more FBI agents walking around, so he decided to go back to Chicago. He was with his wife and his good buddy, John Paul Chase. On their way back, they saw 2 carloads of FBI agents coming from Chicago to Lake Geneva. Babyface swerved his car off the road, ran one of them into a ditch and the other one into a park in Barrington, just north of the Chicago suburbs. There he got out and he started blasting at them. They're shooting at him. By the time he gets to their car, he's filled with bullet holes. But he realizes they're in no position to fire back, so again he kicks them out of their vehicle and drives off. Later they would find his abandoned vehicle, and you can see by the amount of bullet damage everywhere, it was a brutal gunfight. In fact, later that night, both of those agents in the vehicle, they would both die from their gunfight with Babyface. The town of Barrington has put a nice memorial marker for these heroes that you can go and see for yourself. The next day, Babyface was found dead on the side of the road as well. He had succumbed to all the bullet wounds. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. If you'd rather not see it, again, close your eyes. Here we go. Babyface dead, about 25 years of age. Basically a kid. Okay, photo's gone. The last of the big names to go was Ma and Fred Barker. They were the only ones still alive and out of prison of the Barker gang. They were renting this home down in Florida. The neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They didn't know they were gangsters, but they would give rides in their fancy automobiles and hand out coins to all the neighbor kids. So the neighbors loved them. But when the authorities found out, that's when things went south. Now, according to the FBI version, they knocked on the door, and when Ma answered, they asked her to surrender peacefully. Her reply was, let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering. Meanwhile, researchers of that era believed that there was no knock on the door. It was just an assault on the house right away. And they believe that within the first minute or two, Ma and Fred were both killed from that gunfight. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, the government shot up the house thinking it was the Barker gang. It went on so long, neighbors started putting lawn chairs out front, watching it like it was some reality TV show. Eventually, after many hours of no gunfire coming from inside the house, the government finally garnered the courage to force the Barkers' hired maintenance man in to see what was going on. And that's when they discovered Ma was dead, unarmed, and a senior with mild at best intelligence. And they thought maybe the general public would not like us going around shooting unarmed senior citizens. So they concocted the story that Ma was a mastermind criminal, public enemy number one. Once the story spread, those who knew Ma best told the media that that woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. They said she liked to spend her time doing jigsaw puzzles and listening to what they called hillbilly music instead. But that's how Ma died. That's how the legend began. Now, word of caution, I'm going to show you Fred and Ma in the morgue. Close your eyes. Here we go. Here are their bullet-riddled bodies in the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. Now, as I mentioned, the neighbors loved them. Even when they found out they were gangsters, they named their local watering hole Ma Barker's Hideaway. You can go there and do some shots and take some shots if you so choose. But besides being killed, the gangster era came to an end very quickly for three main reasons. One, the repeal of Prohibition. Once bootleggers were making millions of dollars a year, it dried up overnight. The second reason is the FBI got much better at fighting these men and women. When they started out, most agents were college graduates who had never fired a weapon in their entire lives. But they got much better very quickly at protecting us from these criminals. But the most important reason was because of us. When people were bootlegging, people really didn't seem to care. But when they started kidnapping us and killing us, we turned them in for the outrageous sums of money that were being offered for their wanted posters. Now, it begs the question then of what do we make of these men and women? Criminals, folk heroes, saints, sinners, something in between? I leave that question up to you to come to your own conclusion. But regardless of what you make of these criminals, I think what should be celebrated is the era in which they operated. They were the A-list celebrities of their day. They changed history, they changed America for the better or for the worse. So I think that's what should be celebrated. So with that, if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here at the library. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd characters. And along the way, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. But it is Wisconsin, so you might want to heed the advice of these travelers and take a precaution. Don't shoot, I ain't Dillinger. So with that, if you have any questions, comments, or stories, sure.
I hear, what about some in Madison area? You hear about the Wonder Bar?
Yes.
And there was one in Monona too.
Yeah, so the Wonder Bar, which who knows what's going to happen to it. Hopefully they'll save it. I don't know. I haven't followed up on that. But one of the stories when I was there was that one of the gangsters is buried behind the fireplace. And that is thought to be haunted as well by that spirit. But if they do tear it down, perhaps they'll find that body. But yeah, that was a gangster hideout as well. And they would often invest. And the problem was, like Al bought property, Capone bought property in a lot of fake names and a lot of relatives' names so it couldn't get taken away from him. But just to give you an idea how big of celebrities these men were, down in Chicago, they would set up a little tourist booth and they would sell tourists for a nickel or a dime a little manila envelope, and it would be stamped, a rare Dillinger photo. And tourists would eat it up, they'd buy it, they'd open it, there'd be nothing in there. So they'd go back and they'd say, hey, this one's empty. And the clerk would say, well, Dillinger must have got away from you too. Brilliant, I thought. Yes.
When we lived in Alaska, I hired a guy whose wife's grandfather was Ralph Capone.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived in Hurley, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And she told me that anytime somebody needed some money or help, Ralph would give it to him.
Yeah, Ralph owned a bar in Mercer for a while too. They tore it down to make something really cool, a parking lot. But yeah, Ralph was, I've talked to people who remember being as kids going into the bar with their parents and like, that's Ralph Capone. You know, he was obviously older then and kind of retired out of it, out of the whole thing. But yeah, people still have fond memories of Ralph.
You didn't say anything about Arkansas.
Oh yeah, I've done this program for 2 hours before and I still haven't touched on any of it. As you see with the book, it's just so much in here that there's just no way to put it all in. Yeah, so, but that leaves you with a nice jumping off point. Yes?
Do the town or the names Two Lakes Restaurant in Almond and Phelps, Wisconsin?
Oh, well, Phelps was a big place, yeah, but that one doesn't ring a bell. Do you have a story about it?
No, I'm just wondering if you did.
Okay. The problem with this is that I had so much trouble. I would go to some of these places with some newspaper clippings or historical documents and hoping that I'd get in there and they'd say, oh yeah, here's everything we have. And most of the time they had no idea what I was talking about. And even worse, some of them could care less. And I felt that was really strange. So it was really hard because even the FBI files that they compiled on these guys were missing a lot of holes. So some of it's speculation, but unless there was a big event, we can assume they probably were at a lot of places, but we don't know for sure because they weren't very great at keeping notes about their crimes and often bribery with the police and politicians, you know, skidded a lot of that off. So a lot of it was very difficult digging. You had to go there firsthand. And for me, the hardest part was going to these places, like let's say you're at Little Bohemia, and you're sitting at the bar, and you're thinking, I'm right here, Dillinger was here, baby, how cool is this? But in your mind, you have to tell yourself it wouldn't have been that great if you were the one they were shooting at back then, because I hear from so many people who say grandma or grandpa owned a restaurant, a gas station. These gangsters showed up and bought $1 or $2 in groceries and gave a 20, 50, 100 and said, keep it. They were great guys, and they might have been until you got in their way, and then they'd shoot you without thinking twice. So there's a legend that they buried $100,000 at Little Bohemia, but I don't believe that's true because most of them would have money belts, and they would leave behind their wives, their weapons, their cars, God forbid their mistresses, but they wouldn't leave behind money because they knew it could get them out of anything. You know, in 1929, you could show up at a farmer's house in the country and give them $100 to drive you into town. They would have drove you to Florida for $100. So money got them out of a lot of stuff. But yeah, Phelps was a big place. Hurley was a big place, of course. Hayward. Yeah, Gurley was so bad that the legend was during Prohibition, if you were a Christian, the last places you'd want to be found were Hurley, Hudson, or Hell. So, yeah, but sure.
My dad's brother, actually his half-brother, was a town constable up at Spire Lake, and he's one that got shot by Babyface Nelson.
Wow.
Yeah. We go up there every 5 years. It was just the 90th anniversary in April. And my cousin has put together a really nice presentation on it all. I'll share it with you afterwards. I got the newspaper article that summarizes it. But his car-bound FBI agent in the car was killed by Babyface Nelson.
Yep.
And my uncle was shot, and he shot 8 times He was in the passenger seat of the car, fell out into a snowbank, which probably saved his life because they didn't find him for 3 hours. And he basically survived. Congress gave him $5,000, and he started a bar right up there.
Yeah.
And
Why not?
made a good living out of it.
Yeah.
So he came back racing and became a carpenter like his dad.
Yeah.
But I'll share that with you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good information.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's half the fun, is because most people that ever saw these men and women, they're gone. Because you'd have to be, Dillinger was dead in 1934, so imagine the math there. But I did speak with a couple people. One actually saw Babyface. He was a young boy, saw him crash into that car near Arlington. And he remembered it when I spoke with him about 15 years ago, and it was still in his mind. So yeah, but most of it's been gone, unfortunately. But I am going to stick around if you want to tell me a story in private or ask me a question. Stop over to my table, grab as many free postcards from me as you want. You can terrorize your enemies because that's the photo on the card. But I want to again thank the library. How great you can come to a program like this at no cost. You can check out a wealth of information from the library, a real treasure for the community. So if you like programs like this one, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here tonight, and they should be applauded, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.